Test one, two, three. Hello, hello, hello. I am John Beckman, Professor John Beckman, Dr. John Beckman, the father said the transgenic mother of sin, your hostess with the mostest. I have been noticing some misconceptions about heredity online. People are really beginning to misunderstand what heredity is and how it works. So heredity is the process through which genetic information encoded in your mothers and fathers is passed on to the next generation. And there are some brewing misconceptions about heredity that are induced by everybody doing their 23andMe sequencing and getting their data. And it's leading them to completely misunderstand heredity. So for context on my credentials, I'm a professor of biotechnology. I have studied heredity for many, many years into the context of Drosophila melanogaster. So I'm an expert on Drosophila genetics, fruit flies. And I do a lot of genetic analysis in my research. So I know quite a bit about heredity, and I'd like to clarify these misconceptions and explain what they are. So the specific misconception that I heard is somebody sequenced their 23andMe genes, and they got the results back. And they said, quote unquote, I have no African DNA. Therefore, I must not be descended from Africans. Because the 23andMe program is telling them that they have 0% heredity from Africa. So I want to explain that misconception because I understand mechanistically what's happening and why they're being miscommunicated to and what they're misunderstanding. So to understand how heredity works, you need to understand what is inherited. So in all biological organisms, they have what's called a genome. Okay. Your genome is literally a string of written letters. So you can imagine here's the start of the string and here's the end of the string. And this sequence of DNA might be A, T, G, C, dot, 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 etc. You have 4 different bases, A, T, G, C, and these letters come together to form these long strings of DNA molecules that are called chromosomes. And humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. So let's say this is chromosome number 1, and let's say this one you got from your dad. You also have a chromosome number 1 from your mom. Okay. So this is a pair of chromosomes, and humans have 23 pairs. So you can imagine these pairs continue in 23 pairs, and each of these chromosomes is essentially different lengths. So you have different lengths of chromosomes. And what you are and your biological program is entirely encoded in the letters that are on these chromosomes. Now, all organisms are made like this in that they have some set number of chromosomes. They have some set of chromosomes, which are all organized of A's, T's, G's, C's, which is written together in like a book or a paragraph or a long, 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 long string of letters. Now, within these chromosomes are what are called genes. So not all of your DNA is important. Some parts of it are important, and other parts are what we call non-coding DNA. So in coding DNA, certain subsections of these letters actually code for functional proteins, and these are called genes. So on this chromosome, imagine there is a gene right here. The symbol for genes is an arrow. So let's call this gene X. And if you understand the central dogma, genes get transcribed into messenger RNA and get made into proteins. Proteins are little machines in your cells that do stuff. So on your chromosomes are discrete genes. Here's gene X, and here's gene Y. And here is gene Z, dot, 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 on and on. Humans have about 23,000 genes. So what you are is a complex of cells, and in every one of those cells, they are made of little machines, little proteins, that are encoded by about 23,000 genes. So you have about 23,000 discrete different machines that are running your biological program. Those are your genes. Now let's talk about how DNA from your mom and your dad might be different. So let's look at gene X from dad and gene X from mom. So you hear, and people will tell you that DNA in your father and DNA from your mother is not identical. You inherit different sets from your mom and different sets from your dad. That is sort of true, and it's sort of not true. That is one of the misconceptions. In both cases, from your dad and from your mom, you are inheriting a copy of this gene X. So if you could imagine whatever machine, whatever little tiny microscopic machine that gene X builds, your dad has one and your mom has one. And so in a sense, those are very, very similar. They're essentially exactly the same machine. A bad analogy would be like, imagine this gene codes for a hammer, a microscopic hammer in the cell that does something. Your dad has a copy of a hammer and your mom has a copy of a hammer, and a hammer is a hammer. So you're still getting like the same thing from your mom and your dad, the same entity, but it's not precisely exactly the same. And to understand how it can be different, you got to look closer at the genes. So let's zoom in here on gene X, which is encoded by a sequence of letters of DNA. Let's say gene X looks like this. Let's say the length of gene X is 1,500 base pairs long. That means the number of A's, T's, G's, C's is about 1,500. Okay, so it's kind of like a long sentence of A's, T's, G's, and C's. How genes can be different is they can acquire what are called SNP point mutations. A point mutation is a single change of one base pair. So imagine your dad had a copy of gene X that looked like this, but your mom has a copy of gene X that looks like this. So in one little spot, your dad has a TTT, and in one little spot, your mom has a TAT. That's what's called a SNP. It's a SNP mutation. It's a point mutation. It's one single base pair difference. The important thing that you need to realize about heredity is if this gene is 1,500 base pairs long, the difference between your dad and your mom at this allele is only 1 out of 1,500 base pairs, which means that instead of being different, your mom and your dad are actually 99.99% the same. It means they share 1,499 base pairs out of that 1,500 that are exactly the same. Okay, if you calculate out that percentage, 1,499 divided by 1,500, that's 99.93% similar at this position in that gene. So the way that 23andMe will misconstrue heredity and concepts of heredity is it looks at these alleles. Let me define this term. An allele is a gene that is different at least one position. So your dad has an allele that is different from your mom's allele. It's essentially saying the genes are different. Okay. And the reason that creates a misconception is 23andMe will tell you that you are different at this gene, or you have different copies of this gene, which is true, but it's also not telling you that you are 99.93% the same in those two copies of those genes. So now let me get back to the out of Africa thing and the misconception that somebody thinks they're not descended from Africans. So the way that 23andMe maps out genetic differences is it has a sample of these genes and it looks for these SNP point mutations. So you might imagine that somebody from Africa has a gene at this position that is a TTT, and you might imagine somebody from Europe has a TAT at this position. And so 23andMe will tell you that this is one discrete difference between your genes and genes from Africa, when in reality, this is 99.93% the same as genes that come from Africa. And so what 23andMe will do is it will add up a summation of all these discrete differences or similarities, and it will give you a total and a percentage out of that total. And so, for example, if it says you are 0% of African descent, it is not saying that you do not share DNA with Africans. In fact, you share 99.93% similarity with Africans. What it is saying is that you have different alleles, and each of those alleles might be different by only one base pair from Africans. But you are still related to all Africans because you are 99.93% the same as those other human organisms in Africa. So let me just pull a world map here and kind of explain or try to explain the out of Africa hypothesis. This one will be better. So the interesting thing about heredity and genetics is Africa has the most diversity, the most human diversity, which means within Africa, you find the most different combinations of alleles. And what that suggests is that very early on, there were pockets of human populations that were subtly different in Africa. So you might have had a green population, a red population, a blue population, a black population, and a gray population. Colors don't mean anything here. I'm just using these as differences. So the reason that we know, or we hypothesize that the out of Africa hypothesis is correct, is because when you sequence human genomes from regions of Europe, imagine you sequence genomes from here, most of the populations, for example, here, look like they come from red populations. So that would suggest that these red populations spread out of Africa and colonized Europe. Now, the fact that the red color is different from the green color does not mean that these are completely different organisms or completely different genomes. It means that they're only different by a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of base pairs, which is minuscule in the broader context of the entire genome. Now, if you sequence other genomes from other regions, maybe you find in Asia, most people look like they descend from blue populations. Okay, that would suggest that the blue people came out of Africa and colonized Asia. This is essentially the gist of out of Africa. And some of the human populations never left Africa and stayed there and have been there since humans have been around, which is why Africa has the most human diversity amongst all the planet. Now, through evolution, over many, many, many years, genomes and populations change and acquire more SNP mutation. Okay, so you might get a few, eventually, at some point, humans in a different population acquire tiny, minute differences in their DNA. Okay, so imagine a purple population. It's acquired a few mutations. So Greenland, people living in Greenland might have acquired a few mutations. Okay, and those SNPs differentiate people from Greenland from Africa. So when 23andMe tells you you have 0% DNA from Africa, it's telling you that your SNPs that you have in your genome mostly align with people from Greenland. It is not saying you share no African DNA, because in fact you share 99.9% African DNA, and you're only different with the other Greenlanders at a few tiny positions in your genome. So that is a misconception that's happening with heredity, is people are not understanding that your genes are almost exactly the same. It's as if I wrote a sentence. This is an example sentence. Imagine this sentence is the writing encoded in one gene. You might be different as a Greenlander because you might have a sentence that looks like this. This is an example sentence. You might have acquired a little bit of a mutation, but in reality, this is the same sentence. It says the same thing. It's coding for the same information. You just have a little bit of a difference. So in reality, instead of thinking yourself as 100% different from other people throughout the world, you're actually mostly the same. You're just different at certain tiny positions. And if you stretch this logic longer and longer and longer, the analogies actually get a little bit more bizarre and interesting. So a human to a chimp, human versus chimp DNA is 99% the same. You are made of the same genes and the same stuff, the same sentences that code for a chimp. You're 99% the same sentences. The difference between a human versus a banana is about 40 to 60%. That means that the sentences that are writing the genes in the human are about 60% the same as the sentences that are writing the banana. So you are 60% the same creature as a banana. Okay, and this is how we know that we descended from what's called the last universal common ancestor. If you look at the phylogenetic or the evolutionary tree of life, it all coalesces towards a single source. This is how we know that we are all related with all organisms on the planet, because most of our sentences are almost exactly the same. Even in bacteria, many of our sentences that encode the machines in our structures and our cells are almost the same exactly. So what 23andMe should be telling you is that you're 99.99% the same as Africans, but you have a discrete set of maybe 100 different SNPs maybe more than 100. I don't know the precise number, but about a certain amount of discrete SNPs. That's a countable number. It's a very small number that makes you subtly different, but you're essentially the same organism. So there's another misconception of heredity because people don't understand genes. They don't understand that you pass on these sentences. So when you're thinking about alleles and you're thinking about inheritance, there's a common saying that if, let's say we're talking about flies, but the analogy could also be for humans. Let's say you have fly X and fly Y. When you cross these flies, you know that they are 50%, the next fly, the offspring, is 50% X and 50% Y. Okay. And let's say you do another cross with a Z. You now know that the percentage of X is now half of this, which is 25%. Okay. And you can keep doing these crosses and it gets less and less percent. Okay. And so what people are starting to say online is they're starting to say that genetically your descendants, after about 5 generations, those descendants are essentially not you. They're essentially saying that because of this pattern of inheritance, your descendants are not really you. That is not true. Okay. Your descendants are 99.99% exactly the same as you, even after this dilutive effect. Because what it's not telling you, what these percentages are referring to is they're telling you that you inherit 50% of the alleles from the father and 50% of the alleles from the mother. But those alleles, if you actually look at those sequences, are essentially the same sequence. So even after your DNA has been diluted 6% based on your alleles, you're still essentially the same creature. And so the better way to think about heredity is that you are a set of genes. You are a set of about 23,000 genes. And your offspring will still be a set of the same 23,000 genes. It just so happens that your offspring will have a few subtle differences at certain base pairs that make them unique. That is the correct way to understand heredity. I hope that helps. I hope this clarifies some of the misconceptions that are being promoted by sort of these results and people interpreting their results of 23andMe. Hopefully that's helpful. I shall meet death head on. Nigga Kane, you've got to get out of here. Beware foul demons and beasts, there are many foes here. The time has come to cleanse my heart. This monastery reeks with evil and corruption. Oh, I hate staining my hands with the blood of foul sorcerers. Eternal suffering would be too great for you, Diablo. Let the gate be your time to die. I shall meet death head on. I shall meet death head on. Nigga Kane, you've got to get out of here. Beware foul demons and beasts, there are many foes here. The prime evils are no more. The prime